I can watch numbers of individuals and see how they fluctuate. And if it doesn't correlate with the OR schedule, I mean, I can think of 2 specific times right now where I've went to an individual and said, "Hey, are you doing all right? I've just noticed some changes in you. You know, I just want to make sure you're doing okay." And those are numbers, but more importantly, those are people. And at the end of the day, that's what, you guys are here about. That's what I'm here for. And that is the people.
Rising above the ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for people, processes and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty, every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go Beyond Clean.
On this episode of Beyond Clean, we are speaking with Cody Troutt, Director of Central Sterile at Williamson Medical Center, and we're going to be talking about your annual review. That's right, Beyond Clean is doing annual reviews of all of our listeners. No, that's not what's happening. Hank, we're going to be really discussing how much data should come into the annual review and in what context with Cody today.
That's right, Justin. And if I had to do your annual review today, let me just say, you would be needs improvement. Score number 2, not getting a raise. No.
Just as long as you don't put me on a pip before I even know anything's going on.
Yeah. This is going to be a great conversation. It's a very important topic. Obviously, there's a lot of importance that's placed on annual reviews, and we have not had this conversation yet on Beyond Clean. We're 200, 300 something episodes into Beyond Clean. We're already 16 seasons. So it's about time to sit down and say, hey, what's happening every year? Is this impacting your pay? It's definitely impacting your ability to grow. So yeah, let's just sit down and have a conversation about how data plays in and plugs in to these important annual discussions.
Well, I know this is going to be a good one because while we haven't talked about it on any episodes, you've written a lot about it over the years. So we're going to be right back with Cody Troutt, Director of Central Sterile at Williamson Medical Center. I'm Justin Poulin.
And I'm Hank Walsh.
From the 17 studios, you're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Joining us now is Cody Troutt, Director of Central Sterile at Williamson Medical Center, and we're going to be continuing this conversation on instrument data and tracking, but today we're going to spin it into your annual review. And so we're going to be talking about how this information specifically, but not entirely, about productivity as well. And what kind of data points are we collecting and how useful are they? So Cody, thanks so much for coming on your very first episode of Beyond Clean.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. I appreciate you and Hank having me on the show.
So I'm hearing your accent there, or at least here in the Northeast, that's an accent where I'm located. Can you tell us a little bit about where you are and your background and, anything else that's kind of relevant to the conversation today?
Yeah, so the accent is solid. I am from Tennessee, born and raised. Spent my entire life here with the exception of some time with Uncle Sam. When I got home from overseas, I got into Central Sterile, got into healthcare, I guess you should say, and then that led me into the Central Sterile environment. It's just been a upward ascension ever since.
Now, I also want to point out the fact that you are a member of our Beyond Clean advisory group. So wanted to thank you for your participation and work towards driving the industry forward and being a great partner with Beyond Clean. So that's not just just for everybody's benefit, the work that we do with Cody isn't just having him come on to the podcast. It's having him engaged in a lot of the activities that we do at Beyond Clean. And that might be marketing. It could be special projects of any kind. It could be presenting at conferences. And I also want to thank you for your service, Cody. And I know many people have that service background and wind up in sterile processing just because what a great learning experience that is for logistics.
Yeah, logistics and, just the throughput, the attention to detail that some of that stuff requires, they really truly do go hand in hand. They complement each other very well.
All right, so we're going to move into these annual reviews and have this conversation today. And before we start talking about how the data points that are collected in a tracking system, how that might be applicable, just talk about annual reviews. Like first off, how are they done when they're done poorly? And how are they done when they're done well and when they are serving a purpose, a good purpose? What purpose is that?
So a poor annual review is when you get surprise or when you give surprise information. So if you get a new set of data or a new idea during an annual review, then as a manager, you're not having enough conversations with your frontline technicians. I wouldn't say that nothing new should ever come out of them, but you shouldn't really be surprised by anything that comes out of them. I review my techs unofficially, of course, daily, weekly, monthly, down there with them, reviewing what they're doing, if any mistakes are being made, if anything is outside of standard processes, and for that matter, just being a part of their team, really and truly. So to answer your question, a poor review is something, I guess, something new coming out of it from a tech or reviewee's perspective. It shouldn't be the first time you hear something.
Yeah, it should be a surprise.
Right.
If you're getting a surprise about your performance and everybody's like, oh yeah, this has been going on for 6 months. About time we told you. That's a problem because that's not an opportunity to improve, and awareness may just not be there. And if you want to have happy employees and ones that are even being intrinsically rewarded just by progressing in their roles, even if you have one that isn't going to be on a performance improvement plan, even if you have one that's getting a good review, not checking in with them and letting them know how they do, they're ultimately going to be unsatisfied. And that's a way to lose a good employee in many cases.
It really is, and there's the old adage of the CEO talking to the CFO, well, what if we train them and they leave, as opposed to what if we don't train them and they stay, and
that's one of my favorite quotes.
Oh yeah. And, you should constantly be developing your people. You should constantly be training your replacement and the person that's going to replace them. That's a pipeline that never stops. They call it a pipeline because it's long and continuous. You know what I mean? As soon as what's in front of you moves on, there's something behind it to backfill it. And that's the way you've got to do your talent. You've got to constantly be coaching them forward, constantly develop them, constantly raising them to the next level, as opposed to being afraid of losing a great tech to another facility as a team lead or losing a great team lead to another facility as a manager. The perspective, or at least my perspective is I have just widened how much I touch my local industry, because the fruits of my labor are now going further out and they're developing people if I've done my job.
So Cody, going back to the purpose of an annual review, you gave a good explanation of why it shouldn't just happen at the annual review, whatever's happening. But what is happening? What is that purpose? What's unique about that conversation as opposed to maybe the normal in the workflow at the elbow, kind of thing, like how you doing, or hey, I realize you're struggling here, or you're doing real great here. What happens at this time once a year?
I think formality. I think that's really the biggest difference. When you're in there elbow deep or those 2-minute touches at the assembly station back in decontam, those are off the cuff conversations that grow relationships. The annual eval is the official conversation that we're going to have on paper that solidifies everything that we've been touching on the last month, quarter, year that's spread out. And we're going to bring all the experiences from the last year, good, bad, and ugly, together, and we're going to put them on paper, and we're going to talk about what you did great, what you didn't do great, and what you can do better. And then I always end that conversation with, what do you need from me? What can I do to help you?
The segue here that I'm going to try to build in, I don't know how smooth it's going to be, but we'll try it anyways. Just this last week, I saw a couple of articles on LinkedIn that were dogging the performance improvement plan, the PIP, as it's known. One of the things that they're saying about it is just how it can be abused by, managers that just don't like employees, and they kind of get them in this process that in some ways can be built to fail, or very difficult to get out of a performance improvement plan if it's built a certain way. And one of the reasons that I wanted to bring you on for this conversation in particular is you have a unique approach to objectifying to approaching these annual reviews in an objective manner. That's probably the better way to say.
Can we keep this on, please? Can we make this part of the interview?
Yes.
Hank?
I mean, everybody knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah, that's the best tip Hank's ever given on the show. When you get them into the office to do their annual review,
you objectify them.
The most successful thing you can do is objectify them.
Okay. Anyways, before I was so rudely interrupted by whoever this co-host is over here, what I was saying is one of the reasons that I wanted to bring you on this episode in particular is you have a unique approach to the place that data plays in these annual reviews. Can you talk about how you integrate the two and maybe why you think there's a place for some objectiveness in these annual review conversations?
Yeah, well, I mean, from a growth perspective, I mean, the only way you know if you or an employee or department is growing is if you measure it. And if you're going to measure something, you gotta have data or data points to measure, and you gotta have kind of a rule for what that's going to look like. And so we've got some of the stereotypical feel-good things in our evaluations. There's a place for those too. It's not this conversation, but there is a place for those. But one of the things that we use from a data perspective is the individual error rate. And so I don't know to what detail you guys want to hear on that, but basically...
Yeah. Go in.
Working with our OR, we've got a patient tracking paper. Every patient that comes back through decontam has the labels stuck to this paper that they used for that case, as well as a patient label, and then names, autographs of the scrub techs that use it. And so we will scan that into our system, and the OR sometimes will leave me what we call love notes. And so let's just say they opened up a minor tray, and it's the label says minor tray 14, right? And so the data tracking system allows me to know exactly what tray it is. And so when they leave me these love notes tied to this specific tray, I can go in and look, and let's say Hank assembled minor tray 14, and he said it was complete, but when we did a count, he was missing a DeBakey. So now that does two things for me. One, that gives me tools to measure an error rate. Two, that allows me to go back to Hank and say, hey, you put this tray together at this date and this time, and you signal or you claim or you said that it was completely assembled, 100%, but the OR's saying that it was shorted to baking. And so that's something that when we do the reporting, we'll have those elbow conversations, and then we'll maintain that data throughout the entire year until it's time for your review. And then we'll present it back as numbers, not as much as, hey, you left out 3 DeBakeys this year, as we would say, you had an error rate of 0.36%.
Okay, so
right?
It is a percent. That was going to be a question, like how you...
Yeah. So what we'll do on a monthly basis is, so I don't use raw production as a measuring point for evaluations. And the reason that I don't do that is because I use the same set of rules for my entire team, with the exception of my leads. And to say that a first shift employee should have the same amount of production as a second shift and a third shift employee, when, the way our staffing is set up, they spend a significant amount of time in decontam. Well, you've got a third shift employee that's doing 6 hours of assembly and a first shift that's doing 2 hours of assembly. So we're not measuring apples for apples.
Yeah, that's so basic. But I want to tell you, there's a lot of disconnect in the industry to that point. Like just looking and saying, hey, what percentage are these different shifts in these different areas? And then being reasonable about what benchmark or what number you're holding across all of them. So I think that's just a very, very important point that you just made.
And what other kind of context can you put on some of these, especially as it relates to various shifts and the varying responsibilities?
Something to add to that is, not all trays are created equal. A camera set is not the same thing as a major chest tray, right? And so all those things played into it. And so when we sit down collaboratively, we decided that production was not a number that we wanted to use to measure the effectiveness, because it's also going to interfere with things like emptying the cart washer, emptying the washer. And so we didn't want those things to not be counted, or we didn't want the exemplary employee that has average or maybe slightly above average assembly rates, but they also keep the cart washer running. They keep the washer disinfectors emptied.
They answer the phone. They answer the
phone, right? And so
they can hear the phone.
Yeah, they can hear it. So the last thing that we wanted to do was punish that employee. And so we just elected to not do production at all, which, some people's like mouths agape right now, but that's something that we chose not to do. And I feel like I've got a close enough eye on my team and my team leads. I will tell you, my staff, they self-regulate, they self-police. If one of them catches another one not doing their job, they'll say something to each other. If it gets to me, then I know they've already had conversations with each other. So
that's good. So it's also not a surprise when it gets to you, not just when it gets into the annual review, but if it gets elevated even, amongst a team members or a team lead and then comes to you, you've built a culture where it shouldn't be a surprise that they're having to sit down with the manager of the department or the director. So let me ask you this about productivity. I get what you're saying. And I definitely think the context of the volume of work, right, is the better way to evaluate performance because it's more about quality. But productivity still seems to have a place, right? Production has a place. I realize you're not doing this, but would you still look at production maybe on a shift by shift basis or something along those lines? Just because how else do you determine staffing needs? How else do you determine if, hey, wait a second, 6 months ago, we were doing this much and keeping up, and now all of a sudden, we've got 20 to 30 trays constantly sitting on the rack on the other side of the washers, not assembled. So now we know there's a bottleneck. How else do you evaluate bottlenecks? And can you use the tracking system data to help you with that?
So absolutely. I said that I did not use production in my evaluations. I did not say that I don't measure production. And I also did not say that I don't post production in the break room for the entire staff to see. So anybody in my staff, it's posted on a monthly basis. Assembly trays and assembly instruments, because you can't measure. I mean, all trays aren't created equal. Decontam trays, decontam instruments, sterilizer loads pushed, and, items scanned to locations or to shelves. Because again, you come back to that. If you don't measure it, then it becomes less of a concern for staff. So you got to be careful what you measure and post and what you don't measure. So the staff know what their production is, and they also know what their buddy's production is. And they also know what their error rate is, because we'll post that too, not as a shameful thing, but we will actually post the factual errors that were made, and the team will look at them collectively. And if we notice trends, then that's how we will guide our education. If we see a certain tray that begins to start coming back with the same error, or if we just start seeing the same error come back, then we know we need to shift our focus.
I like a couple of things about what you just said. The first piece is about that kind of collaborative approach to errors. To get into another one of these just real common sense, if you stop and think about it, of holding the assembler accountable for errors that actually started in decontam or are potentially started in the operating room, but, we're missing a debakey, right? Well, did the tray not come down with a debakey? Okay. So there was an error that was made in the operating room somewhere, that instrument migration happened. Now, decontam, we're not really counting instruments typically, so that's not that big a deal. But if you think about it in terms of bioburden, for instance, let's just say that debakey was there, but it was dirty. Well, it's supposed to be caught in the assembly stage, no doubt. But if it's not caught, it's not like the assembler is the only one that had eyes on it or the only one who had responsibility for it. So I really love that you're putting those things up there to have a collaborative conversation to say, all right, guys, we're having a lot of dirties and they may not be caught here, but yeah.
So we actually take it one step deeper. And so we've got two layers of errors that we capture and that we post. And one is on the assembly side, and that's where most of them are accrued. But we also do them on the decontam side. And so if a tray makes it to the OR, right, we view that as our product. And so from a department perspective, it doesn't matter where the failure was because we delivered a less than optimal product. But for improvement's sake, when we look at the errors, if it's something like bioburden, retained cement, anything that traces back to decontam, then whoever decontamed that is also, that error is on them and the assembler. And so it actually hits the department twice. Whoever did the decontam and whoever did the assembly. And the funny thing is every now and then you'll see one or two people get hit twice.
Mm-hmm. Because they cleaned it and assembled it all.
Yeah, and so just every facility's got people. They've got their favorite trays, right? Everybody has trays they love, trays they hate, and so they tend to gravitate towards them in decontam and on the assembly side. And so if they miss cement on a freer and then they go assemble it, once they get out of decontam later or the next day or whatever, and they miss it again, well, they just got 2 marks against them.
Yeah, never trust yourself. That was one of the first lessons that I learned from a quality assurance technician in our department, because it's not uncommon to assemble the same tray that you've decontaminated. And yeah, that's the easiest thing in the world. It's like, oh, well, I just saw this tray. I know it's clean. No. That's mistake number one. Now, the other point that I found very interesting, I want to tie this back, this annual performance review question and conversation is to your comment about the staff. Like by the time a concern gets to you, they would have already talked to their coworkers, right? And that is a very unique leadership model and culture that's been developed there. It leads back, I've written at least one article about this topic of drama in sterile processing. And when you're sitting down to review an employee, what you don't want is all this kind of chatter in the background. Various people have said certain things to you of like, Johnny never works when you leave, or like on the weekends, Johnny's always doing X, Y, and Z, but you've never gotten any like true confirmation that can be tied to an individual like, just talking like adults, right? It really seems like your model helps to guard against that because the employees and the staff are so open with each other and kind of in it together that it's not worth trying to circumvent that to go to you and blame somebody or say something, because you're going to push it back down and say, well, who are you referencing? What is the data around this? Like, give me some evidence. Is that how that kind of plays out at these annual reviews? Or how do you cultivate that, I guess, amongst the staff?
It is a little bit. And so when I'm doing annual evals, I don't tolerate conversations about other techs. If I'm doing an eval for Hank, we're talking about Hank. If those things come up in the elbow conversations or the stop by the office conversations, depending on what it is and the severity, those type things. But a lot of times I like to ask, well, did you ask them about it? Did you say something to them? And that you can't always do that depending on what it is and how high the passions are running and those type things. But that's always one of the great questions to go back with is, what'd you say to them? Did you ask them about it? Did you confront them about it?
Right.
And that's the self-regulation part.
I want to go back to that data piece real quick, because this is a unique model. Not every department tech is going to be familiar or perhaps even comfortable with this. So how do those conversations go when you have a tech in your office for the first time for their first annual review, and you're like, listen, we're not going to be talking about production data. We're going to be talking about quality data and all these other objective measurements. Like, how do they respond?
So they typically respond with, okay, yes, sir. And that's just kind of what they take, especially when they're newer. But in the orientation with new hires, one of the things that we talk about is how you're going to be measured and at what frequency. And so we use similar tools for the 90-day as we do for the annual eval, but we tell them, hey, listen, you're going to have an individual error rate. You're going to have a tray completion percentage.
So they know that already once they're out. Yeah.
It's not hidden. Yeah, it's not hidden at all. And I'll even, some of them don't care. Some of them, they want to know, they want to learn, but I'll tell some of them, here's the math. Here's how we come to that. We'll take your total number of trays and we'll divide your number of errors by your total number of assembly trays. And that's how we get the error rate. And, one time I was actually challenged on that. One of my heavy decontam techs said, if I make a couple of errors in decontam, well, I've only spent an hour or two on assembly side. So I'm only doing like 200 trays a month. And I really had to step back for probably a good solid week and then call him back in and say, you know what? I appreciate you challenging me on that. And I want you to know why I use this formula. And I did consider other ones, especially after the conversation. And that is that we collectively as a department are graded on our final product. And our final product are the trays that we produce that we give to the OR in this pretty blue package or rigid container package. And so when they open this present that we wrapped up for them, if it's not perfect, it doesn't really matter where the failure was. There was a failure. And so I had to have something. I had to measure it with something. And so nothing made more sense than the final product.
I'm going to throw a curveball here because a lot of this conversation makes me think of a recent article and conversation that I had around instrument data on technicians' resumes. Because if you look at resumes of the majority of our sterile processing technicians out there, all you see is where they've worked in the past, how many years experience, what credentials they have. You do not see any instrument data. By and large, seeing as you have put a lot of value around instrument data, particularly quality data in annual reviews, do you see a place for this kind of data on resumes, and would you find that valuable as a hiring manager?
I would absolutely find it valuable as a hiring manager. The difficulty would be setting the standard. Who's going to set the standard? Who's going to be willing to adopt the standard? And are we all playing by the same
let's have a conversation. Let's have a conversation with the Beyond Clean Advisor Group. I think this is a good challenge, for us to really sit down as an industry and as a group and say, hey, would it benefit all of us to set that quality standard, that measurement that everyone can measure to? Because this is different from a benchmark, right? It's not saying the goal or whatever. It's to say, let's all just use the same measurement so that there's standardization across resumes, across comparisons. Like, I think that's definitely a potential there. I'm just going to say right now, let's have a side conversation about that. And anyone else who's interested, reach out to us. As we wrap up here, or kind of start to wrap up here, Cody, I want to ask about gaps. There's a lot of great data that you're pulling together to tell the story of the individual technician in a 12-month period, in context of the whole team, in context of the feedback from the OR customer. But what else would you like to have? What other kind of data would you find valuable in giving this constructive feedback to your technicians to grow over time?
I think some of the gaps that will be difficult to measure is going to be, the feedback that we get from the OR. And so, first of all, any feedback is unquestionably appreciated, and the more the merrier. The difficult thing is when I get a tray or I get a form and it says contaminated, right? And so it's hard to improve the technician when I say, hey, Hank, that minor tray you put up yesterday was contaminated. Because what are you going to ask me?
Right.
With what? How?
Yeah.
Where?
Was it the suction?
Was it the suction? Was there something in the what did I miss, basically? Because, you could have left a clip off the end of the container, or there could have been bioburden in the teeth. You could have not put a tip protector on. You could have left indicators out, right? And so, now you're going to be worrying about what does contaminated mean. The driven tech is going to, pull his bootstraps up and continue on. But the quality of feedback that you get from the OR, it can't be high enough. You just can't get there.
What about data to reinforce positive behavior? I'm sorry to jump in on that, but we've talked a lot about process improvements and getting the data where we can figure out how to improve. But I feel like sometimes, and especially we just did an interview on old school versus new school, getting that positive reinforcement. Like, do we always get data other than, as you said, somebody who's just a top performer in that area of quality and low error rates? But are there other ways to collect data, and especially in this conversation around getting feedback from, the internal customer or other internal stakeholders that can be utilized? Like, how do we track that kind of stuff?
Right. And so here's the thing about data. It's neither positive nor negative. It just is. Right. And so we produce this information, certain trackers, monthly. And so if you perceive it as negative or those are your numbers. Now, if Justin is assembling 250 trays a month on average, and last month he did 276 trays, that's a positive for Justin. But if Hank averages 450 trays a month and he sees Justin's 276, hopefully he'll keep it to himself. But you know what I mean? It's all about perspective.
And we already had the conversation about Hank's quality throughout this interview. So I know when he gets into his annual review, we're going to have a conversation about his error rates.
And so that's one of the beauties about the data that we post monthly, because there are a handful of texts that immediately come to mind that when I post this, they come and they look at their numbers. A couple of them are even competitive. Who's got the highest decontam numbers? Who's got the highest assembly numbers? And if one of them...
Yeah, there's a lot of pride.
There is.
There's a lot of pride. And
if one of them beats the other one, then they'll immediately go to the quality number, or some kind of other round robin. And so
I love
those numbers are, they're drivers. And I know you were asking about ways to improve the positivity or to make it more of a blessing than a curse, I guess, so to speak. But, data is data. It's not good. It's not bad. It's historical. It's what you did. And so if you want good data, work for it.
It's what's great about it too, the way you just described it, there's lots of data and it is what it is, but it is representative of where your staff take pride. And so you can really not leverage that, but if you're looking to give somebody credit, it's very clear where they stand out in the work that they've done. And it's very clear where the opportunity is. And as each member of the team, because you post all of this and make it visible, as they take pride, there might be an area where one employee, one staff member doesn't take as much pride, but when they see somebody else have that level of pride, they almost want to raise that standard up because they want to have the area that they're good at, that they take pride in. But then they want to match this other area too. So I can see where you take the good and the bad out of it so that it doesn't get ugly, and you make it objective so that everybody can create space to thrive. I really love your leadership
and
style.
Justin, one thing that came out of this that was honestly and truly not an intention, it was an unintended positive consequence. And that is, I can see changes in people. And what I mean by that is, if somebody's lost a loved one, I can see it in their numbers. If somebody's gaining a loved one, or, somebody gets a new car, or, things that impact us on, because at the end of the day, we're all doing life together, right? And so those things affect our work habits, our relationships, and everything else. And so I can watch numbers of individuals and see how they fluctuate. And if it doesn't correlate with the OR schedule, I can think of two specific times right now where I've went to an individual and said, "Hey, are you doing all right? I've just noticed some changes in you. I just want to make sure you're doing okay." And those are numbers, but more importantly, those are people. And at the end of the day, that's what you guys are here about. That's what I'm here for. And that is the people.
Cody, I don't know what to say, man. You killed it. Not just on this interview, but you're killing it at work every day. Great job, man. Thanks for coming on.
Appreciate that. I thank you guys for having me.
That was Cody Troutt, Director of Central Sterile at Williamson Medical Center. And, we talked about tracking systems and we talked about the data that we can get from them and really any kind of tracking. We haven't limited this season to simply, tracking systems themselves. But I think the biggest thing here was really looking at productivity.
No.
Really through more of a quality.
Yeah.
Kind of lens, in terms of, you're like, no, I'm shooting you down.
No, we
I got you a couple of times in that interview. So yeah, I probably had that coming, but we're talking about your productivity and the lack of quality. I think
and how slow I am. Yes.
But,
yeah, that part I agree with.
Cody was picking on you. Yeah. This was just a great interview. Seriously. So many awesome takeaways from him today.
Especially those comments at the end where he's connecting the dots. Like, this is not just about the data. It's not even just about the productivity. To your point, Justin, all of this happens in the context of a person. It's personalized. And that's so in line with the vision of Beyond Clean, so baked into who we are. In fact, it's in the mission statement for the people, the products and the processes that are pushing the industry forward. We're all about how this comes out and plays out in the day-to-day life of frontline technicians, of department leaders, of the vendors who support us. Like, all of this happens in a personal setting. So yeah, Cody did a terrific job connecting that data to the heart and really showing, I think, like a great example of leadership style that is proactive and preemptive. You know, like he even started the interview saying, hey, if you come into your annual review and you're surprised, I failed. Like, man, that's a good enough takeaway for the whole interview. And he was just getting started.
Yeah, this was inspiring. There's absolutely no doubt. And, you know, trying to get that culture where everybody is communicating and talking to each other. So not just that surprise, not being a surprise in the annual review, but any kind of a concern within the department by the time it gets to the manager or the director, that it's not even a surprise to your coworker. That's just a whole nother level of transparency and honesty. And I think sharing the data the way they do. And we always talk about focusing on the process, not the individual, not personalizing it allows teams to flourish. And I just heard so many examples of excellent culture and leadership. So it was an inspiration today. That's going to do it for the show. But as a reminder, you can support Beyond Clean by subscribing on Apple, Amazon, or Google Podcasts. We're also available on Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or search for Beyond Clean on your favorite podcast application. But the very best way to access our episodes is to download the smartphone app for iPhone and Android. And we've got bonus content for several of those episodes for you. Just click on the gift box to see if there's any there. And while you're downloading the smartphone app, we'd appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. And finally, if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, just send an email on over to info@beyondclean.net. On behalf of Hank and myself, thanks for listening to this week's episode of Beyond Clean.